Jeremy Corbyn, Member of Parliament from United Kingdom. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me here today to this conference. I found it absolutely fascinating and returning a favour when Marisa kindly came to London to speak at the Coalition of Resistance conference that we held at the beginning of October, and thank her very much for her contribution there, which she explained an awful lot of what was happening in Portugal and across Europe. And I have brought some copies of this document here from the Coalition of Resistance in Britain, which has been trying to coordinate anti-cuts activities and to put forward an alternative so that those that are mobilizing to defend their own communities against hospital closures, school closures, unemployment, and all the benefit cuts that are taking place have something to unite around. And I think it's very important that we do more than just analyze the crisis that we're in. We provide a way forward for people to unite around and make those demands, because the situation facing all of our people all across Europe is very, very serious indeed. I represent a tough, in the sense of very demanding, inner urban community in the British Parliament, where there are over 70 different languages spoken. There are people that come from all areas of the world, and there are a very large number of people living in quite serious poverty, despite living in a very wealthy city such as London. And unemployment for them is always been high and is rising very fast, particularly for young people. But in putting the debate in the European context, I want to, if I may, Marisa, just explain a couple of things about the debate about Europe that's going on in Britain, which I suspect is rather different from the debate that's going on in other countries across Europe. Britain is not a member of the Euro, didn't join the European Economic Union until 1971, was not a founding member of it, and the debate about membership of the European Union has always been quite intense, and indeed is still being conducted, in a sense, in two ways. There is a very right-wing debate against Europe, which is essentially right-wing conservatives who want to recreate the British Empire, and they see the European Union as an impediment to the recreation of the British Empire. And some of them, I'm serious, they really do believe it. You know, they should be pitied. You should have, come on, we're socialists, we should have sympathy for people. They condemn the European Union and all its works. The more market-orientated conservatives condemn the social aspects of Europe in the sense of environmental regulation, working time directive, social legislation, all those kind of areas of European law and European rulings. The left, who are critical but not necessarily in favour of leaving the European Union, are very concerned about what I agree with, a very serious democratic deficit in the way in which the European Union operates, an incredibly serious democratic deficit in the European Central Bank and the operation of the euro, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And for those reasons, many of us voted against the Maastricht Treaty when it came to our Parliament in the 1990s. I voted against it because of the convergence criteria, because of the ban on state subsidizing of industries, and because of the ban on subsidizing any kind of state deficit. It was to create a market Europe. And the interesting thing is that Margaret Thatcher, who is presented as the most, what we call Eurosceptic of British prime ministers, was certainly very opposed to the European Union in many ways. But it was her and her government that put through the Single European Act, and it was a successor to her in terms of John Major, who put through the Maastricht Treaty. So they were quite happy to have market disciplines imposed upon the working class across Europe. They were quite happy to have the convergence criteria. They were quite happy to have an opt-out from the social agenda of Europe, providing they could get the market side of it. And I think it's that debate that's continuing at the present time. Now, Margaret Thatcher's legacy, and this is one that we're living with now, was that from her election in 1979, throughout the 1980s, that government was the leading European government pushing forward a monetarist agenda, Reaganomics. The monetarism was first experimented by Pinochet in Chile in the 1970s, later in Europe by Thatcher, and certainly in the USA by Ronald Reagan. That led to the closure of most of the big manufacturing industries in Britain, the end of state subsidies, huge levels of privatization of all publicly owned industries and assets. In 1979, 45% of GDP was in public hands in Britain. She halved that during her time as Prime Minister through cheap sales of telecoms and everything else, and created a massive gap between the rich and the poor, and what we call a SPIV economy, which is a sort of basically an economy based on dealing with money rather than dealing with things. Other European countries didn't follow the same agenda. The 1990s, British growth was very fast indeed, but it was based on a service economy, and also, the whole of Europe indeed benefited from this, a lowering of the prices of manufactured imports from China. So this whole nexus of deindustrialization, finance, service-based monetary economy, cheap imports from China, and excessive levels of very easy credit being thrown at everybody for everything, led to a property bubble, led to the credit crisis, as in the USA, and led to the banking disaster of 2007, 2008. Throughout the banking crisis, the attitude of the then Labour government of Gordon Brown was that they had to put money into the economy to maintain demand. They had to increase the spending power of the poorest, and so for a while, and indeed welcome, benefits were increased, pensions were increased, so the poorest people did have an increase in spending power as a way of getting through the crisis. It was hardly socialist economics, but at least it gave something towards John Maynard Keynes and his ideas. That was quite an important step forward, and also took virtually all the banks either into complete public ownership or into partial public ownership. But it was not nationalisation of the banks, it was not social ownership of the banks, it was a publicly owned holding company that bought the shares in the banks, and that publicly owned holding company's job is to sell the shares back into the private sector. And one of the key demands that we are making is that if banks are sold back into the private sector, they should be sold back as cooperatives or mutuals, or remain in public ownership, but with a change in the management, change in the directors, so they operate for the good of the society as a whole, not for the good of the banking classes as a whole. And I think that is a demand we should all be making in each of our own countries at the present time. Now, one of the many mistakes Tony Blair made as Prime Minister, I won't talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, there isn't time, was to make the Bank of England independent of government, and its again, its requirement was that it maintains a level of low inflation, i.e. price stability in the UK. It hasn't been terribly good at that, but that's what it's supposed to do. It cannot be directly controlled by central government any more than the European Central Bank is controlled by the European Parliament or indeed by any national government. What we have in Europe is this massive democratic deficit of a straitjacket of an economic policy put down through Maastricht and the European Central Bank and the euro currency, which doesn't defend living standards, doesn't defend welfare states, doesn't defend health services, but does protect the market, does protect banking interests, and we can't control what it does. We need to make some democratic demands all across this continent of ours. I'll give you an example of what's going on at the moment, because we'd all have very broadly similar stories in our own countries. Unemployment in Britain is rising. It's lower than Portugal and Spain, but it's rising quite fast. It's nationally 8% and rising quite quickly. Youth unemployment is 20%, but the number of people not active in the economy, i.e. unemployed or in education, or not receiving benefits or in education or training, is 23% of the workforce and not being productive in that sense. And so the 8% unemployment figure hides many other things. There is enormous cuts being made in the welfare budget, enormous cuts being made in what's called housing benefit, which is a rent support system in Britain, throwing the poorest people to the wolves of the market rather than sustaining their security of tenure. University fees maximum level has gone up by 300%. A very important system we had of giving all young people between 16 and 19 a grant of £30 per week to remain in full-time education. Very important for children from working class families to encourage them to stay on at college and go to university. That has been removed and cut. And the unions are being told, union members are being told that they have to take a change in their pension arrangements in the public sector to pay higher contributions, retire later, and get lower benefits. This has led to a massive level of opposition, and despite the anti-trade union laws in Britain, we've reached a situation where possibly 3 to 4 million workers will take strike action on November the 30th in defence of the public sector pension. And this includes unions that organise both within the public sector and the private sector. And the argument we use is if we allow the government to destroy the public sector pension, the private sector pensions can't be far behind. It's a very, very important dispute that's going on. And so we have to think of where we go from here. The austerity package being forced upon the people of Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, is vicious, is cruel, and is unnecessary. And it's very similar to the austerity packages the International Monetary Fund has forced on countries in Central America, Latin America, Africa, and South Asia over the past 30 years. The narrative is always the same. Cut public expenditure, privatize public services, introduce a market economy, create a greater gap between the rich and the poor, but above all, every government must pay every penny to the banks that the banks have lent, despite rolling up rates of interest and all the costs that go with it. And one article I saw last week indicated that the amount of interest paid by the government of Greece to banks in the current year is more than the total public sector wage bill for all government employees in Greece, and the situation will get worse as it goes on, and the parallel is there in every other economy. So we have to have some kind of coherent left alternative to this. None of this is necessary. So we demand job protection, we demand protection of the welfare state, and we demand, I think, cuts in arms expenditure and defence expenditure, because I was in Portugal a year ago at the NATO summit. I wasn't at the NATO summit, I was at an alternative to the NATO summit, and we all marched together through the centre of Lisbon that weekend. What did that summit do? Required its members to maintain a level of expenditure on weapons of mass destruction and arms in order that NATO will have a global reach at all times. And the European Union, through the Lisbon Treaty, has brought itself directly as almost part of NATO. I think it's perfectly right to call, in the case of my country, for the abolition of our nuclear weapons and non-replacement of them, and in every other country for a reduction in arms expenditure and end this nonsense of NATO's right to intervene anywhere around the world. That is a reasonable part of the programme. The last point is this. This crisis is made by a system that worships money, not people. This crisis is a product of a banking system. So whilst we have to maneuver our way around day to day, week to week, to get through crisis after crisis after crisis, should we not instead be saying, we don't just want the banks bailed out, we want the banks and the banking system, instead of holding us to ransom, run as a democratic institution, run in the interests of the people, nationalise the debt rather than impoverish large numbers of people all across this continent and indeed all around the world. And I'll conclude with a quote from a great man, a lovely man, I've had the pleasure of meeting on a number of occasions and listening to him, Noam Chomsky, in an article about the occupation movements that's going on around the world, in London, where the Church of England has got involved, God bless them. He says, the most exciting aspect of the Occupy movement is the construction of the linkages that are taking place all over. If they can be sustained and expanded, Occupy can lead to dedicated efforts to set society on a more humane course. We don't have to be frightened of this crisis. We have to see it as an opportunity for many people to be educated into the realities of the dangers of free market capitalism and where it leads us to. Thank you very much for inviting me today.